On their honeymoon in a luxury resort, a millionaire and his new wife are greeted not with champagne, but with his ex, now the resort's owner. As cameras flash and bank accounts freeze, she holds the receipts. What he thought was paradise quickly turns into the most public downfall of his life. The ocean breeze kissed the pavement just beyond the edge of the private airstrip, where the engines of the sleek silver jet still hummed as they cooled. Brett Langford stepped down from the aircraft first, his sunglasses already in place, shielding his eyes from the golden Costa Rican sun that spread itself over the lush horizon like a warm promise. At his side, Tessa descended gracefully in heels too high for the tarmac and a white silk dress that clung to her like ambition. Her manicured hand held tightly onto Brett's arm, her bright smile beaming with the confidence of someone who believed she had finally arrived. The air was humid but sweet, fragrant with salt and the distant scent of hibiscus. A sleek black SUV idled at the bottom of the steps. The driver jumped out immediately and opened the door for them, nodding in deference. Brett didn't return the gesture. He adjusted his Rolex and slipped into the back seat without a word. Tessa followed, her legs crossed before the door even shut. "Welcome to paradise, Mrs. Langford," Brett said with a smirk, brushing a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear. Tessa giggled, pressing her lips against his jaw. "I could get used to this," she said, already scrolling through her phone. "Do they know we're arriving early?" Brett scoffed. "Of course they do. I've arranged everything. Full oceanfront suite, private pool, champagne waiting on ice. This place caters to people like me." Tessa's eyes sparkled as they sped through winding roads lined with palms, the resort finally emerging like a mirage, whitewashed buildings cascading down the hillside, surrounded by manicured greenery and infinity pools that seemed to spill into the Pacific. As they stepped into the lobby, cool air greeted them like a whisper of wealth. Polished marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. A line of staff in crisp uniforms stood at attention behind the counter, but none dared to look directly at the couple. Brett walked with the air of a man used to being admired, used to being obeyed. Tessa, in designer sunglasses and diamond earrings, followed him like a walking advertisement for trophy wives. He was basking in his decision, young, beautiful, docile, and grateful. Everything his ex-wife had stopped being long ago. "Langford, Brett Langford, presidential suite," he said to the concierge, tapping the counter once, impatiently. The concierge hesitated. "One moment, please, sir." Brett raised an eyebrow. "It's already paid in full. I made the reservation myself. We're here on our honeymoon." "Yes, of course, sir. I just need to confirm the details with our general manager. If you'll have a seat in the lounge, we'll take care of everything shortly." The tension was subtle, but it crept under Brett's skin like static electricity. He didn't like delays. He especially didn't like being made to wait. Tessa didn't seem to notice. She took selfies against the tropical backdrop, captioning them with words like #wifey and #blessed. Brett sat stiffly, jaw tightening as the concierge made a quiet call behind the desk. No one offered them a drink. No one rushed over to apologize. After 10 minutes, Brett stood. "Is there a problem?" The concierge straightened. "Our general manager is on her way, sir. She'll assist you personally." "Fantastic," Brett muttered, pacing now. "We'll see how long she lasts in this job." Then, from behind a frosted glass partition, a door opened. The sound of firm heels echoed through the lobby. Brett turned toward the noise and froze. The woman walking toward him wore a tailored navy dress. Her dark hair swept into a low bun. There was nothing rushed about her movements, nothing apologetic. She walked like she owned the ground beneath her, each step deliberate, precise, powerful. "Caroline." He blinked, uncertain for a moment if he was hallucinating. His ex-wife stood before him with a cool smile, clipboard in hand. Her presence was so calm, so prepared, that it knocked the breath right out of his lungs. "Brett," she said smoothly, as if she'd just bumped into an old acquaintance at a country club. "I didn't expect to see you so soon. Welcome to Villa Estrella." Tessa looked up from her phone. "Who's she?" Brett's voice caught, but he recovered quickly. "This is Caroline, my ex-wife." Caroline nodded once toward Tessa. "And you must be the new Mrs. Langford." Her eyes flicked to the ring on Tessa's hand, then back to her eyes, studying her like an artifact in a museum. "Congratulations." Tessa, unsure whether she was being complimented or insulted, smiled thinly. Thanks. Brett cleared his throat, squaring his shoulders. What exactly is going on here? You work here now. I don't work here, Brett. I own it, Caroline said, her voice calm but firm. I acquired the resort 6 months ago. A smart investment, actually. He stared at her. You bought this place? She turned her clipboard to him and showed him the letterhead. Her name was there in bold serif font. Caroline Langford, Managing Director. A stamp of finality. A signature of control. Tessa blinked. Wait, she owns the resort? Like owns it. Caroline smiled politely. That's correct. Now, regarding your reservation, there's a small issue I need to discuss with you privately. Brett's eyes narrowed. We have a suite reserved. Confirmed. Paid for. Yes, Caroline agreed, flipping through a document. However, our system flagged the transaction as potentially fraudulent. Tessa gasped. What? That's ridiculous. Caroline looked directly at Brett. Our accounting department cross-referenced the source of payment. The wire came from an account that, as of our last legal filing, was a joint marital asset. And since the finalization of the divorce occurred after the booking date, and the funds had not yet been split, we have a problem. Brett's face flushed. You're reaching. I'm enforcing legal boundaries, she said smoothly. You see, Brett, when you withdrew funds from our shared investment account to pay for a luxury honeymoon without disclosing it during asset division, that's considered concealment. Possibly fraud. You wouldn't. I already did. Tessa stood, backing away slightly. Is this true? She whispered to Brett. He didn't answer. Caroline handed him a folder. Inside were printed documents, highlighted statements, a copy of their divorce agreement, and several emails. Until this is resolved, your reservation has been canceled. Your account access, frozen, per court order. You can't do this. Oh, but I can, Caroline said. And I have. Tessa's face twisted. So we're just homeless? On our honeymoon, Caroline turned to the front desk. Please escort Mr. Langford and his guest to a private car. They'll be departing shortly. As Brett opened his mouth to protest, flashbulbs exploded through the windows. Photographers, reporters, microphones pressed against the glass. Someone had tipped them off. And as Brett turned in slow horror, Caroline calmly turned away and disappeared through the same door she entered, leaving behind the storm she had orchestrated so perfectly. Tessa grabbed her bag, her voice trembling. You said this was all yours. You said we were set. Brett couldn't answer. The reporters were already flooding inside, and the heat outside was nothing compared to the fire now consuming him from within. He had come here to celebrate a new chapter, but he didn't know this book was being written by someone else entirely. What would you do if your ex ruined your honeymoon in front of the world? Drop a comment and tell us. Would you stand your ground or run like his new bride? And hey, if you're loving this story so far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and help us keep telling these wild stories. Every bit of support, comments, likes, and even your gifts helps us bring more drama to your screen. The car ride away from the resort was silent, thick with heat and confusion. Brett's fingers drummed against the armrest as the vehicle turned down a palm-lined road, away from the cliffside luxury he'd so confidently booked just days ago. Tessa sat beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. But Brett didn't need to see her expression to know what she was thinking. Her breathing was sharp, clipped, each exhale a countdown to a blow-up. And yet, she stayed quiet. For now, they were taken not to another hotel, not to a luxury villa, but to a guest house near town. Far more modest. Beige walls, a rusted fan spinning lazily on the ceiling, and no champagne on ice. The concierge had made the reservation on their behalf, explaining that it was the only available suite in the area due to a local festival. Brett hadn't believed him. He was sure Caroline had planned it, planned every last detail. He slammed the bedroom door shut the moment they entered. Tessa wandered around the small suite like a cat thrown into unfamiliar territory. Are you going to explain what just happened? She asked at last, her voice low and dangerous. Brett didn't turn. He stared out the small window facing a parking lot. It's nothing. She's bitter. She's looking for attention. Tessa scoffed, throwing her designer bag onto the couch. She didn't look bitter. She looked like a woman who just won something. She hasn't won anything. Brett snapped, spinning around. This resort nonsense. Just a stunt. She can't hold on to it. I know Caroline. She's not a businesswoman. Tessa raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Because from where I was standing, she looked pretty in control. She had the staff, the paperwork, the confidence. Hell, she had the press waiting. Brett didn't answer. He pulled off his jacket and tossed it onto the bed. The silence stretched again, uncomfortable and loaded. Tessa finally sat down and began scrolling through her phone. After a few minutes, she let out a bitter laugh. What? Brett asked. She's trending, Tessa muttered. Your ex-wife. #Caroline comeback. There's even a clip going viral of her saying your reservation was canceled on ethical grounds. She held up the phone so Brett could see a still frame of Caroline, eyes calm, jaw firm. The caption read, "No woman should have to watch her life fund another's honeymoon." He stared at it, unblinking. A storm churned behind his eyes. She called the media, he said slowly. She knew I was coming. She waited until I stepped inside and then dropped the bomb. Tessa didn't respond. She was already watching more clips, already reading the public reaction. Sympathy poured in for Caroline. Fury directed at Brett. People called him a thief, a manipulator. They praised Caroline for reclaiming her dignity and showing other women how to do the same. Brett sat down heavily. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tessa laughed again, bitter this time. You're right. This was supposed to be our honeymoon. You said everything was handled. You said you were the master of details. I was. I am. His voice was sharp, desperate. I didn't think she'd outsmart you. Tessa interrupted. Because she did. Publicly. He shot her a glare, but she didn't back down. She'd gone from sweet and affectionate to cold and distant in the span of an hour. It didn't surprise Brett. He knew what kind of person he'd married. Tessa liked power, comfort, luxury, and she didn't hide it. The moment it looked like the perks were gone, so was her patience. I'll fix this, he said. I hope so, she replied, rising and heading to the bathroom. Because I didn't come all this way to play second fiddle in your ex-wife's revenge plot. Brett waited until the door clicked shut behind her before pulling out his phone. He called his lawyer. Straight to voicemail. He called the bank. Frozen accounts. He tried calling the resort. No one picked up. Then, finally, he called Caroline. To his surprise, she answered. Hello, Brett. Her voice was calm. Neutral. I want to talk. Privately, he said. That's what we're doing now. No. In person. A pause. Then, tomorrow. 10 a.m. My office. She hung up before he could respond. The next morning, Brett put on his best linen shirt and slacks, trying to look unfazed. Tessa didn't come. She'd claimed she had a headache and needed a spa day, paid in cash. Brett left alone. The drive to the resort was short, but each turn of the wheels felt like a spiral. When he arrived, the front desk staff greeted him with polite disinterest, directing him to the manager's office. No special treatment. No titles. Just a man in trouble. He was led to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sea. Caroline stood behind a sleek desk, sorting through a stack of folders. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, she gestured to a chair without speaking. You've made your point, Brett began. Caroline didn't smile. This isn't about making a point. Really? Because it looked pretty orchestrated from where I was standing. I warned you not to cross lines during the divorce, she said, still calm. You did anyway. I didn't think you'd come after me like this. That's the problem, Brett. You didn't think. She walked around the desk and leaned against the edge, arms crossed. You used our shared assets to fund a wedding, a ring, and a vacation with the woman you cheated on me with. Did you really think there would be no consequences? She wasn't the reason we divorced, he said defensively. She was the confirmation that the divorce was overdue, Caroline replied. He stared at her, studying her face. She wasn't emotional. Not angry, not gleeful, just composed. That made it worse. I came here to work this out, he said. Not to fight. Then admit you were wrong. Sign a statement acknowledging misuse of funds. Agree to a settlement. A new one. Caroline nodded. One that reflects reality. Brett scoffed. You're bleeding me dry. No, she said quietly. I'm taking back what's mine. He rose from the chair. You planned this from the start. I planned to protect myself, she replied. That's what women do when men like you underestimate them. He paused at the door, his voice lower. And the media? That was protection too? Caroline tilted her head. That was power. Something you thought I'd never learn to use. He left the office without another word. Outside, the sun was blinding. He squinted into it like a man seeing daylight for the first time after a long time underground. His phone buzzed again. More headlines. More photos. His name attached to scandal, fraud, disgrace. Back at the guest house, Tessa was packing. "You're leaving?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Your accounts are frozen. The resort won't take your card. And I don't do budget hotels." "You're serious?" Tessa zipped her suitcase. "You wanted a young, fun wife? Here's the deal. We like comfort. If you can't provide that, we bounce." He watched as she pulled her sunglasses down over her eyes and walked out the door without so much as a goodbye. Brett sat down on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. Caroline had always said one day he'd trip over his own ego. He just never imagined it would happen so publicly, or that she'd be the one standing above him when he fell. And still, something told him this was far from over. The walls of the guest house felt like they were closing in. Brett sat on the edge of the narrow bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands gripping the back of his neck. His shirt clung to his back with sweat that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. Outside the cracked window, the buzz of cicadas was interrupted by the occasional honk or the soft rumble of a scooter passing on the nearby street. But inside, silence reigned. The place smelled like old fabric and lemon-scented cleaner. It was meant to be temporary, just a brief stop on the path to a honeymoon that was supposed to be perfect. Now it felt like exile. His phone buzzed. He lunged for it, hoping it was his lawyer or someone from the bank finally calling him back. It wasn't. It was another headline. Another article. Ex-wife outsmarts millionaire husband in fiery legal showdown at luxury resort. Mistress bride fled as resort turns against groom. Caroline Langford exposes fraud on honeymoon day. He threw the phone onto the bed and stood abruptly, pacing across the tiny room. There was barely enough space to walk in a straight line. He banged his hand lightly against the doorframe and looked around, as if the walls were mocking him. Brett Langford, a man who had commanded boardrooms, manipulated markets, and dined with celebrities, now left sweating in a faded room with a flickering ceiling fan and no wife. Tessa was gone, her perfume still faintly lingering in the air like an echo of arrogance and lost chances. The knock on the door startled him. A hotel staff member in a tan uniform stood there with an envelope. "Mr. Langford?" "Yes." Brett answered, already tense. "This was dropped off for you." The man handed it over with a slight nod and walked away without waiting for a tip. Brett ripped it open. Inside were official-looking documents, neatly bound. On top, a letter from his attorney, finally. But his relief evaporated quickly as he read the first few lines. Effective immediately, all joint marital assets under investigation have been frozen by court order pending resolution of ongoing disputes regarding unauthorized financial withdrawals. He skipped down the page. Words like embezzlement, fraudulent misappropriation, and civil liability screamed back at him. It didn't make sense. How had Caroline moved so fast? How had she gotten all this power? There were depositions scheduled, statements required, hearings pending. He would need to fly back, hire a crisis manager, figure out how to contain this before his name was permanently burned across the financial world as another fallen tycoon. He flipped through the rest of the file. There were highlighted bank statements, travel receipts, an itemized breakdown of every expense he'd racked up on the honeymoon so far, all traceable, all damning. Charges for the private jet, the 5-figure ring, the pre-wedding spa packages for Tessa, and even the down payment for the suite at Villa Estrella. Everything had come from accounts Caroline could tie to their still unsettled divorce fund. Brett had always assumed no one paid attention to those details. That was what lawyers were for. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who cleaned up his messes. But now, no one was answering his calls. He was alone. He went to the nightstand and opened his laptop. Maybe there was still time to fix this. A press release, perhaps. A public apology. Or spin it. He could say the charges were a misunderstanding, that he hadn't been aware of the legal nuances. Make himself look like a victim of outdated divorce laws. He opened his browser. But his email was locked. So was his investment portal. He tried accessing a familiar account. Access denied. He tried another. Denied. Then, the most humiliating moment of all, he opened his personal bank app, typed in his credentials, and watched as the screen flashed. Balance. $0 no. He whispered aloud, his voice cracking with disbelief. He refreshed the page, as if it were some digital trick. Nothing changed. And just like that, the illusion of control shattered. Caroline hadn't just humiliated him. She had stripped him of power. Quietly, methodically, and in full view of the public. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed again, head in his hands. Later that afternoon, he tried to leave the guest house for a walk, hoping fresh air would help clear his head. But he barely made it down the road before two young tourists recognized him from a viral video. "Hey, you're the guy, Caroline's ex, right?" one of them called, laughing, phone raised to record. He didn't respond. He turned around and walked faster, nearly breaking into a run. Back inside the room, he closed the curtains tightly and stood in the dim light, panting. He hated the feeling of being hunted, of being prey. But worse than that, he hated the feeling of being irrelevant, disposable. That night, unable to sleep, Brett drank whiskey from a plastic cup he'd found in the mini fridge. It burned going down, but it numbed the panic rising in his chest. He turned on the TV just to hear noise, but every channel seemed to be playing some version of his downfall. A talk show host made a joke about him losing not only his wife, but his mistress on the same day. Another host praised Caroline's legal acumen and called her a modern-day heroine. Brett watched his name become a punchline in real time. He was no longer the man in control. He was the scandal, the lesson, the meme. Sometime near dawn, he fell asleep in the stiff armchair, clothes rumpled, his phone still buzzing with alerts he refused to check. When he woke, a sliver of sunlight had broken through the curtain. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the ceiling fan. He stretched and felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down again, heavier somehow after a few hours of broken rest. There was a knock at the door again. He stood, wary this time. It wasn't a courier. It was a local journalist, polite but persistent. "Mr. Langford, may I have a moment of your time? Just a quick statement." Brett tried to shut the door, but the journalist held up a tablet. On the screen was a press conference announcement. Caroline Langford would be addressing the public that afternoon from the resort's main hall. "This story's not going away, sir," the man said. "You might want to be ready." Brett shut the door in his face. He slumped onto the bed. Then, something in him clicked. If Caroline wanted war, she'd get it. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. She might have frozen his assets, stolen his honeymoon, and embarrassed him in front of the world, but he still had something left. He still had his pride, and he would find a way to use it. He always did, or so he thought. The resort was glowing in the late afternoon sun, every window of Villa Estrella's main building catching gold from the horizon like fire trapped in glass. The manicured lawns had been freshly trimmed, the pool deck cleared of guests, and a line of staff stood at attention with practiced grace. The air smelled of orchids and salt, sweetened by luxury, but just beneath the polished surface, there was tension. An electric kind, the kind that precedes a spectacle. Outside the main entrance, a velvet rope had been set up. Dozens of journalists and photographers waited just beyond it, some in polo shirts and sun hats, others in sleek blazers, their cameras glinting under the tropical light. The whispers had started early that morning. Caroline Langford would be making a public statement. No one knew what it would be about exactly, but the guesses were loud and varied. Financial retaliation, legal declarations, maybe even a veiled warning to other women in high society. All they knew for sure was this: she had invited them. Inside, Brett was losing what little composure he had left. He stood near the guest house window again, phone in hand, fists clenched. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his linen shirt. He had tried to bluff his way through the last few hours, calling in favors, threatening legal countersuits, insisting he had a plan. But the truth was, he was drowning. The press conference had caught him off guard. Caroline wasn't just fighting back behind the scenes, she was going public. She was turning their private mess into a national headline, and every step she took seemed perfectly choreographed. He checked the time. Less than an hour to go. He wanted to be there. Needed to be. Maybe he could spin it. Maybe he could walk in, charm the cameras, take the spotlight from her. He was still Brett Langford. That had to count for something. With that thought, he straightened his collar, splashed cold water on his face, and ordered a cab. When he arrived at the resort gates, security was tight. Too tight. A man in a black suit stepped forward, glanced at a list on his tablet, then looked up at Brett with a polite but firm expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Langford. You're not permitted entry to the event." "What? I built this place. You were invited to a private meeting. You declined. This is a press event. The list is final." Brett's jaw clenched. "Let me speak to Caroline. She's unavailable." He stared at the guard for a few seconds, then turned sharply and stormed away, heart pounding. The reporters caught sight of him through the gate and rushed over, but he pushed past them, ignoring the barrage of questions. One camera caught him muttering profanities under his breath as he shoved a microphone away. That clip would go viral an hour later. Inside the main hall, however, everything was serene. Caroline stood behind a podium dressed in a light cream suit that contrasted beautifully with her bronzed skin and dark hair. She looked powerful without being ostentatious, graceful without trying. Her team stood off to the side, legal advisors, PR specialists, and her resort staff, all ready to support her. When she stepped forward and took the microphone, the flash of cameras began immediately. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "I hadn't originally planned on speaking publicly, but recent events have made it necessary to address a few important matters, not just for myself, but for many women who've been silenced, underestimated, or discarded." The room fell quiet. She continued, "This resort was purchased with the portion of my divorce settlement that I fought for, rightfully. I chose to invest in something meaningful, something restorative. I had no intention of involving my personal life in the resort's operations. But when I discovered that my ex-husband had used joint marital funds, without consent, to fund a lavish honeymoon with the woman he left me for, I could not, in good conscience, remain silent." A collective murmur rippled through the room. I followed the legal path. I filed the appropriate claims. I froze the accounts. And today, I stand here not to humiliate him, but to make something very clear: financial manipulation is abuse. It's not just unethical, it's illegal. And I will not allow it to be normalized or hidden behind wealth and charm. More flashbulbs. More frantic scribbling from reporters. But Caroline didn't flinch. She held up a folder. "These are the financial records, audited and verified. I will be submitting them to the proper authorities. What happens next is up to the legal system. But for the women watching this, those who have been taken advantage of, dismissed, or disrespected, I want you to know that silence is not your only option." Applause erupted, not the forced kind, but a swelling wave of it. Caroline paused, letting it settle. "And as for this resort," she added with a slight smile, "I intend for it to become a sanctuary, not a playground for those who treat others as disposable. We are creating programs to help women recover financially from divorce, offering retreats focused on empowerment, and starting with a donation fund that will match the cost of my ex-husband's canceled honeymoon, down to the last cent." The crowd laughed. Some clapped again. Cameras clicked wildly. Outside, Brett sat in the back of the taxi watching a live stream from his phone. His face was ghost pale, his hand trembling slightly as Caroline's words played in his ear. He could hear her voice echoing even through the screen, confident and unapologetic. The driver glanced back at him in the mirror. "You okay, man?" Brett didn't answer. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: powerlessness. And it burned. Across town, in a quiet corner cafe, Tessa sipped a cocktail while watching the same live stream. She was sitting across from a man she'd met earlier that day at a resort spa. Younger, tan, an influencer type with an audience and a camera crew. As Caroline's speech wrapped up, Tessa closed her phone and looked at her new friend with a smirk. "Guess I married the wrong millionaire." The man laughed. "You married him?" "For now," she replied. Back at Villa Estrella, Caroline stepped away from the podium and walked past the crowd. Her team gathered behind her. She didn't stop to bask in applause. She didn't need to. She had already won. In the days that followed, her clip was shared across every platform. She was interviewed by morning talk shows, praised in editorials, and featured in think pieces about feminine resilience in luxury spaces. She never once said Brett's name again. She didn't have to. Everyone else was saying it for her, and not in the way he liked. He'd been erased from the narrative, reduced to a cautionary tale, a warning. And worse, it was only just beginning. The evening heat was stifling, even with the ceiling fan rattling overhead like it might tear itself free from the plaster. The guest house had grown unbearable, an echo chamber of shattered expectations, stale perfume, and financial ruin. Brett sat on the couch, the cushion beneath him sagging, his shirt unbuttoned halfway and clinging to his skin. In his right hand was a glass of warm gin. It wasn't his drink of choice. He preferred aged bourbon served over a single, perfect cube of ice. But this place didn't offer luxury. Not anymore. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the press conference. He hadn't needed to. The world had spoken loud enough. The door creaked open, and Tessa walked in with a slow, deliberate strut that made Brett sit up slightly, his eyes narrowing. She was wearing one of the tight silk dresses he had gifted her before the wedding. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, echoing through the small room. She had a pair of sunglasses perched on her head, even though the sun had already dipped behind the buildings. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between indifference and fury. "Where have you been?" Brett asked, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in hours. "Out," she said, tossing her purse on the table with a dull thud. "Figured I'd get some air before the rest of your empire implodes." Brett chuckled dryly. "Glad to see you're still making time for sarcasm." Tessa turned, crossing her arms. "What do you expect me to say? That I'm proud of you? That I'm thrilled to be staying in a motel while the world laughs at our expense?" "I didn't ask you to stay," Brett snapped, standing up now, the heat between them suddenly rising. "You could have left days ago." She laughed bitterly. "Don't pretend this wasn't supposed to be my dream, too. You promised me the world, Brett. You told me I was different, better, that I'd never have to lift a finger, that I'd be worshipped, adored, photographed in front of marble infinity pools while everyone else scrolled in envy. And you believed that," he scoffed, gesturing wildly. "That's on you. Don't you dare," she hissed. "You sold me a fantasy. You used me to rewrite the end of your marriage and parade me around like an upgrade. And you used me for my money. At least I was honest about it." Silence settled between them. The only sound was the distant hum of mopeds in the street and the dull whir of the ceiling fan fighting to survive. Tessa sat down, her expression softening just slightly. "What's the plan now, Brett? Are you going to fix this? Or are we just waiting for the next article to drop?" "I don't know," he admitted, finally sitting beside her. "I didn't expect her to hit this hard." Tessa shook her head slowly. "You should have. She's not some discarded ornament, Brett. She's smarter than you gave her credit for." He exhaled through his nose, biting the inside of his cheek. "I underestimated her." "No," she corrected. "You erased her. You didn't just replace her, you erased her. That's the difference. And now? Now she's rewriting the story without you." He stared at the floor, gripping the empty glass until his knuckles turned white. "She called the media. She humiliated me." Tessa shrugged. "She exposed you. There's a difference." Brett didn't respond. He felt hollow, like someone had gutted him and left just the shape of the man he used to be. Everything felt heavy now. His name, his face, his future. "I can't stay here," Tessa said suddenly, her voice quieter now. "Not like this. I didn't sign up for broke and bitter." "Then leave," Brett muttered, barely audible. She turned to him with narrowed eyes. "Don't think you get to play the martyr. You're not the victim, Brett. You're just the guy who got caught." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in days. The gloss was fading from her lips, the illusion slipping from her eyes. He had once seen her as a symbol of youth and freedom, a fresh start, a prize. Now she looked like a mirror, showing him everything he didn't want to admit about himself. "Where will you go?" he asked flatly. Tessa grabbed her purse. "Somewhere with air conditioning. And people who don't pretend everything's fine when their world's falling apart." She paused at the door. "You should be careful, Brett. The way you've lived, it catches up." And just like that, she was gone. Brett sat in the stillness, letting her words settle. There was no point in calling after her. No point in trying to convince her to stay. The truth was, he didn't even want her to. She had served her purpose, just as he had once served his in her life. Now the transaction was complete. He stood and poured the rest of the gin down the sink, watching the clear liquid spiral away like the life he once thought untouchable. There had to be a way out of this. A reversal. A new plan. He was Brett Langford. He'd built an empire from scratch. He could find another angle. But as the sky outside darkened and the first stars blinked into view, his confidence began to unravel further. For every call he made, there was no answer. Every ally he once trusted was silent. One had forwarded his message to voicemail with a curt auto-reply. Currently reevaluating professional affiliations. Best of luck. Brett slammed the phone down, harder than he needed to. He checked his email, again, still locked out. He tried to log into his business networks, only to find that his executive privileges had been suspended pending internal investigation. His company, the one he had spent 15 years building, was distancing itself. By midnight, the final blow arrived. A new article, posted by one of the same tabloids that had once praised him for his wedding to Tessa, now headlined, "Langford Legacy Crumbles. Former Wife Exposes Luxury Lies." The article was brutal. It dissected his finances, highlighted the frozen assets, and named the 3 luxury events: engagement party, wedding, honeymoon, all paid for with joint funds during the divorce proceedings. It quoted Caroline's speech, included images of Tessa leaving the guest house, and featured leaked footage of Brett yelling at reporters at the resort gates. He scrolled to the bottom and froze. There it was, a quote from one of his board members. "We support accountability at all levels. The company will continue to operate with integrity, and we are reviewing all executive conduct to uphold that standard." Brett lowered the phone slowly. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was existential. The business, his name, his image. Everything was unraveling in slow motion, and all he could do was watch. He collapsed back onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. The fan spun uselessly above him, blades dull with dust, circling the same air over and over. Outside, a storm was building, low thunder rumbling beyond the hills. But Brett didn't hear it. He was too busy replaying the last few months in his head. The decisions, the arrogance, the blind confidence that nothing could touch him. And now, alone in the dark, with no money, no allies, and no wife, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't the one holding the power anymore. Caroline was, and he had no idea what she would do next. Brett Langford had always been a man who believed in forward momentum. He never looked back, never dwelled on what had been lost or left behind. Regret, to him, had always been a weakness reserved for lesser men. Those who lacked the guts to chase ambition, the stomach to make hard calls, the instinct to cut ties and climb higher. But now, lying flat on a borrowed bed in a dim guest room that smelled faintly of mold and soap, staring at a cracked ceiling with nothing but his own breath for company, regret slithered its way into him like a slow-moving poison. He couldn't sleep. He hadn't really slept in days. Not since the moment Caroline walked into that lobby with the poise of a queen and a folder of carefully documented revenge. The ceiling fan creaked above him, struggling to spin against the heavy air. The only light came from the pale moonlight slipping through slatted blinds. Brett turned his head to stare at the glow, and without meaning to, his mind pulled him backwards. Years, maybe more. He didn't fight it this time. He remembered Caroline's laugh first. Not the sharp, poised laugh from recent interviews, but the unguarded one. The one she used to let slip when they stayed up late, eating cold pizza and talking about business ideas. Back then, she had dreams of opening a non-profit for underprivileged girls. He'd laughed and said he'd fund it once he closed his 3rd real estate deal. She laughed, too, and said she didn't want his money. She wanted him to believe in something that wasn't just about returns and branding. She used to wear oversized sweaters around their old apartment, the one they barely afforded in their early 20s. He remembered watching her dance barefoot in the kitchen while stirring pasta, her hair tied in a knot, humming something off-key. He remembered thinking, briefly, that he was the luckiest man alive. But as success came knocking, so did change. With each new deal, each zero added to his net worth, Caroline became less of a partner and more of a background character in the narrative he was writing for himself. He stopped hearing her, and she, quietly, devastatingly, stopped trying to be heard. His mistakes hadn't begun with Tessa. They began with the first time he canceled a dinner Caroline had planned because some investor had invited him to an exclusive poker night. They deepened when he told her to stop worrying about the business he built, because you don't get how these things work. They turned unforgivable the night she found a message on his phone from an assistant named Tessa. A message that wasn't explicit, not exactly, but hinted too much at a relationship that wasn't just professional. Back then, he hadn't even tried to deny it. He remembered her standing by the window in their penthouse, her voice quiet. "Just tell me the truth, Brett. I can take the truth." And all he'd said was, "Does it matter?" That was the moment she stopped crying. That was the moment she looked at him not like a man she loved, but like a man she no longer recognized. The divorce didn't come immediately, but it might as well have. The emotional exit had already happened that night. He rolled over, groaning at the weight of those memories. He didn't want them, but they kept coming. The board meetings where he'd talked about his wife as if she were a charity case. The cocktail parties where he introduced Tessa as his upgrade, with a wink that made even his business partners uncomfortable. The smug smile he'd worn signing the divorce papers, thinking he'd won because he got to keep the penthouse, and she walked away with a settlement he thought wouldn't stretch very far. Now she owned a resort. Now she had the media on her side. Now she had the world calling her an icon. And he was the man who used joint funds to pay for a honeymoon with his mistress. That narrative was carved into the internet now, beyond his reach, beyond his ability to erase or buy his way out of. He sat up in bed, restless, and walked over to the window. The street outside was empty except for a cat slinking through shadows and the occasional flicker of passing headlights. The silence gnawed at him. He missed the hum of city life, the constant vibration of deals in motion. Here, all he had were his thoughts, and they were loud. His phone had only 10% battery left, but he powered it on again, scrolling through contact after contact. So many names, so many former allies, all silent. He hovered over Caroline's name more than once, thumb trembling above the call button. What would he even say? "I'm sorry, you win." He wasn't even sure what she would do if he called. Answer? Hang up? Laugh? He didn't call her. Instead, he opened a private message from one of his oldest friends, Mason, a man he'd known since business school. Mason had texted 2 days ago, before the media firestorm, with a simple message. "You sure about this marriage, man? You're playing a dangerous game." Brett never responded. Now, he typed slowly, "You were right." He hit send. A moment passed. Then the message changed to read. Another moment. Nothing more came. Even Mason didn't know what to say. He tossed the phone on the nightstand, rubbed his face with both hands, and muttered into the quiet room, "I screwed up." It was the first time he said it out loud. The next morning, Brett walked down to a local cafe, hoodie pulled over his head, sunglasses on despite the clouded sky. He ordered black coffee and sat at the farthest table, back to the window. He didn't want to be recognized, not by tourists, not by locals, not even by himself. A group of travelers sat nearby, chatting in Spanish. He didn't understand much, but he heard Caroline's name. He looked up. One of the women held a phone, playing the video of the press conference. They were smiling, admiring her. One of them even raised her coffee and toasted softly, "Para Caroline." He looked away, jaw tightening. She was more than a headline now. She was a symbol, and symbols don't fade quickly. His coffee tasted bitter. Or maybe that was just his mood. Later that afternoon, he walked along the beach alone, feet sinking into hot sand, the surf crashing nearby with maddening rhythm. He watched families laughing, couples strolling hand in hand, tourists snapping photos against the ocean backdrop. All around him, life went on, uncaring of his downfall. He sat on a rock and stared at the water. In the distance, a yacht drifted lazily under the sun. For a brief moment, he imagined being on that boat, sipping champagne, laughing with Tessa, with Caroline far behind him, invisible in the rearview mirror of his life. But the image shattered quickly. Even in his fantasies now, Caroline was there, calm, patient, watching from the shore, unbothered, untouchable. She had built something from the wreckage. And he had turned gold into sand. The tide crept closer, lapping at his shoes. He didn't move. Let it soak him. Let it rise. Maybe it would wash away the pieces of the man he used to be, the illusions he clung to like armor. Maybe it would help him see clearly for the first time in years. He didn't know what came next, but for once, he was starting to understand why that terrified him. Caroline Langford stood in her office at Villa Estrella with the doors open to the balcony, letting the sea breeze curl into the room. The light filtered through the sheer curtains and long ribbons, casting soft shadows on the hardwood floor. Below, the infinity pool shimmered, guests laughed over brunch in the terrace cafe, and a string quartet played softly beneath a white canopy. It looked like paradise, and in many ways, it was. But for Caroline, paradise wasn't the pool or the ocean view. It was this moment, the calm after the storm, the silence that follows a strategic checkmate. She moved slowly around the room, heels clicking against the floor, eyes scanning the neatly arranged folders on her desk. Each document, each spreadsheet, was a thread in a larger tapestry she'd spent months weaving. Her assistant, Marisol, entered with 2 iced coffees in hand and a tablet under her arm. Caroline took the coffee with a soft smile and gestured for her to sit. "Updates?" she asked, not breaking stride. Marisol tapped her screen. We've received 2 more partnership inquiries this morning. One from a women's financial literacy foundation, the other from a legal advocacy group. Both want to collaborate on the retreat program you outlined. Caroline nodded, satisfied. Good. Schedule calls with both. I want our mission to have credibility and substance. This isn't just PR. Marisol grinned. That's obvious. You've built something real here, Caroline. People are noticing. Caroline didn't respond right away. She walked to the window and looked out across the ocean, arms folded. Her expression was unreadable, thoughtful. Finally, she spoke, voice lower, more deliberate. I didn't start this to punish Brett. Not exactly. I started it to prove to myself that I could exist beyond him, that I could thrive. The media loves the revenge angle, but the truth is, the only person I needed to beat was who I used to be with him. Marisol's voice softened. And the woman you are now. She doesn't need to win. She just needs to build. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze fluttered a few pages on the desk, and Caroline reached out to anchor them with a delicate hand, her gold bracelet catching the light. She turned back toward her assistant. I want the first women's retreat scheduled for the end of next month. 3 days, full programming. Workshops on asset protection, legal rights, rebuilding after divorce. Find a keynote speaker, someone who's walked the fire and come out clean. Marisol was already taking notes, her fingers moving rapidly. I'll put together a list. Also, Caroline added, reach out to our legal advisor. I want to follow up on the case against Brett. I know the public side is over, but the real work is making sure it sticks. Marisol paused. Do you think he'll try to fight it? Caroline exhaled slowly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Of course, men like him always do. But fighting requires energy. And right now, he's out of steam, out of allies, out of leverage. He'll swing once or twice more, then vanish into whatever's left of his legacy. She crossed the room again, her movements precise. On the wall behind her desk hung a single black and white photo, her and Brett, years ago, standing in front of their first apartment. They looked young, ambitious, deluded. She'd kept the photo not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of how far she'd come. She stared at it for a long moment before finally removing it from the hook and placing it face down inside a drawer. That chapter was closed. Downstairs in the cafe, 2 women sat with cappuccinos and laptops, discussing Caroline's interview from the night before. One of them pulled up a clip and turned the screen toward the other, who watched in silence as Caroline's words played. This isn't about vengeance, she said on screen. It's about power, reclaiming it, redistributing it, teaching women how to hold it. She's incredible, the woman whispered, awe in her voice. Can you imagine doing something like that after your marriage blows up? Not just doing something, the other replied, but building an empire on top of the ruins. Back upstairs, Caroline was deep in a strategy session with her financial advisor, a middle-aged woman named Evelyn whose silver hair was always pinned perfectly in place. Evelyn tapped her tablet, bringing up a series of graphs and figures. Our Q2 revenue projections have increased by 23% since last week. And the charity arm, Women Reclaiming Wealth, has already received more than $150,000 in direct donations. Caroline nodded. We'll match that from the resort's profits. Are you sure? Evelyn asked, arching an eyebrow. That's a significant pledge. I'm sure, Caroline replied firmly. This resort was never meant to be just about luxury. It's a symbol, and symbols only matter if they help someone else. She glanced at the monitor on the wall, where a news ticker scrolled across a muted financial news network. Brett's name appeared briefly, Langford Holdings CEO under investigation. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned off the screen with the remote. Evelyn leaned back. You know, I've worked with dozens of clients after divorce, but no one's ever done what you're doing. You're not just surviving, Caroline. You're redefining what comes next. Caroline let the words sit between them for a moment before answering. That's the point. I want women to stop asking, how do I get through this? And start asking, what can I build from this? Outside, the sky had shifted to a soft orange, the sun lowering over the horizon in slow motion. From the balcony, Caroline watched guests gathering for evening cocktails on the terrace. Somewhere below, someone was playing soft jazz on a saxophone. She held her coffee cup to her lips and inhaled deeply, letting the aroma calm her. Marisol returned with a printout in hand. One more thing, she said, hesitating. A local paper wants to do a cover story. Not about Brett. About you. Your story. Your mission. They want to title it Queen of the Comeback. Caroline gave a small, amused shake of her head. No more headlines about revenge. If they want to talk, they'll do it on my terms. This isn't about a man anymore. It never was. Marisol smiled and made a note. Understood. Caroline stood quietly for a long moment, watching the sun sink behind the waves. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by the cooling balm of dusk. She felt something in her chest loosen. Not pride, not triumph. Peace. She had turned her pain into a blueprint, her humiliation into architecture, her silence into a megaphone. And the best part? She was just getting started. The airport buzzed with life as travelers shuffled through the bright terminal, dragging suitcases and scanning flight schedules on high-mounted monitors. Brett stood in the middle of it all, wearing clothes that hadn't been pressed in days, his face pale, hair tousled, and his jaw clenched tightly. He carried no luggage. He had nothing to carry. His leather duffel bag had been stolen from the guest house 2 nights ago, and he hadn't bothered to replace it. He only had his phone, his passport, and a pitiful sense of pride that was unraveling more by the hour. He was supposed to be on a flight back to New York, a return to familiar territory where he could meet with his lawyers, reclaim some dignity, maybe even remind a few people who he used to be. The airline counter clerk had just confirmed that his reservation, paid weeks in advance, was still intact. It was the first sliver of hope he'd had in days. But as he stepped toward the security checkpoint, 2 men in Navy uniforms intercepted him. "Mr. Brett Langford?" one asked, politely but firmly. Brett froze. "Yes. We've been asked to inform you that your departure has been temporarily suspended under court instruction. Your passport has been flagged." "What?" he asked, eyes wide. "Flagged for what? We're not authorized to discuss the details. You'll need to contact your legal representation." Brett stood speechless as the 2 men stepped back and gestured for him to exit the queue. People stared. A few took out phones. The humiliation crept up his neck like fire, and without another word, he turned around and stormed out of the terminal, his shoes slapping against the polished floor. Outside, the heat slapped him harder than the security guards had. The sunlight felt cruel, exposing everything he'd been trying to hide beneath buttoned collars and forced smiles. He called his attorney, hands shaking. Voicemail. Again. He called the backup counsel, someone he hadn't spoken to since the early days of his marriage, a man who once toasted his rise to CEO over $400 whiskey. This time, someone answered. "Langford," the voice said flatly. "I need to know why my passport was flagged." A pause. Then, "You haven't seen the latest court filing?" "No. I've been busy." The voice sighed. "There's a temporary injunction. Caroline's lawyers petitioned for an emergency freeze on your movement based on potential financial flight risk. It was granted. There's now a scheduled hearing to determine whether international travel will be permitted during the asset investigation." "This is insane," Brett snapped. "She's treating me like a fugitive." "Well," the lawyer replied carefully, "given the funds used, and the timing, and the fact that you tried to leave the country without notifying the court, you're not exactly inspiring confidence." "I wasn't running," Brett said bitterly. "I was trying to go home. Maybe you should stop calling New York home. That penthouse isn't yours anymore." The line went dead. Brett stared at the screen. He hadn't even been given the chance to yell. When he finally got a ride back into town, it was dusk. The sky hung heavy with clouds, dark and ready to burst. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he trudged up the steps of the guest house, the soles of his designer shoes peeling at the edges. The owner, a graying woman who had stopped making eye contact days ago, stood in the doorway holding an envelope. "This came for you." He took it wordlessly and stepped into his room. The envelope bore the name of his holding company. Inside, a formal letter with the company header. "Effective immediately, the board has decided to relieve Mr. Langford of all executive duties pending the outcome of legal investigations. The company will proceed under interim leadership." There was no call, no warning, no courtesy, just paper, final and cold. He sat on the bed, letting the letter fall from his fingers. Outside, the first drops of rain began to splatter against the window. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. The notifications were all the same now. Headlines, updates, speculation. He opened one article anyway. The headline stung. "From millionaire to meltdown, the Brett Langford collapse." The article detailed every misstep. It quoted anonymous sources, likely people he'd once called friends, claiming they saw the downfall coming. It painted Caroline as poised, graceful, and strategic. It painted Brett as careless, vain, and reckless. And worst of all, it was accurate. He tried to tell himself it would blow over, that scandals faded and reputations could be bought back. But this didn't feel temporary anymore. This felt permanent. A slow, public unraveling that no amount of damage control could fix. The rain intensified. Brett walked to the window and leaned against it, watching the drops slide down the glass like slow tears. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't package or sell. He felt loss. Not the kind that comes from losing things, but the kind that comes from realizing what you threw away. The marriage, the respect, the empire. It was all built on fragile ground, and Caroline, patient, strategic, and unshakable, had watched him take the first swing at its foundation. Then, she simply waited for it to fall. He wandered into the bathroom and stared at his reflection. He looked older, hollow, like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 days. The lines around his mouth were deeper, the arrogance in his eyes now replaced by fatigue. He splashed water on his face, gripped the sink, and tried to hold himself together. Downstairs, a knock came at the front door. Brett ignored it at first, but it came again. Reluctantly, he opened the door. It was a local journalist, young, polite, persistent. "Mr. Langford, would you be open to an exclusive? Something to clarify your side of the story." Brett stared at him, soaked in rain, holding a recorder in one hand. "I don't have a story anymore," Brett muttered. "Just a mess." The journalist hesitated, unsure whether to press. But Brett stepped aside, allowing the door to close between them with finality. He went back to his bed, collapsed onto it fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. For a long while, he didn't move. The thunder rolled again, closer this time. The storm was here now, and it wasn't leaving any time soon. His mind wandered. To the beach. To Caroline. To the night they signed the final papers, and he had laughed at her parting words. "You'll see what you gave up. Not all at once, but piece by piece." Now the pieces were gone. The wealth, the image, the wife, the mistress, the business, the future, and all that was left was Brett Langford. Alone. And finally, no longer untouchable. The sun hung low over the water like a lantern slowly dimming, casting long shadows on the white sand that wrapped around the edge of Villa Estrella like a soft embrace. A light wind carried the scent of salt and blooming hibiscus across the resort grounds, rustling the tall palms and causing the sheer white curtains on the oceanfront terrace to dance gently in the breeze. It was a rare moment of stillness, the kind that didn't ask for attention, that simply existed in its quiet beauty. And Caroline Langford was exactly where she wanted to be, in a chair facing the sea, barefoot, legs curled beneath her, a soft linen shawl draped over her shoulders, and a ceramic mug of chamomile tea cooling slowly in her hands. She wasn't thinking about headlines or business meetings, not about lawyers or asset sheets or guest room occupancy rates. She wasn't thinking about him. Not actively. Not anymore. He was there, sure, like a painting that still hung in the corner of her memory, but one she didn't bother dusting off anymore. She had learned that some people never truly disappear. You just learn to stop letting them take up space in your daily thoughts. The waves lapped gently against the shore, rhythmic and soothing, like the pulse of the earth. Caroline watched them come and go, again and again, endless and unconcerned with the drama of human life. Somewhere behind her, the resort hummed with quiet success. Guests laughing over wine at dinner, the clink of cutlery, the shuffle of sandals on stone pathways. She'd built this. Not just the walls and gardens and views, but the purpose behind it. She had turned a hollowed-out version of herself into something solid. She had planted roots where there was once only displacement. She had found herself again in the ruins he left behind. Her phone buzzed once on the table beside her. She glanced at it without urgency. A voicemail. The name made her still. Brett Langford. She didn't open it. She simply stared at the screen for a few seconds, then reached for the phone, held it loosely, and set it back down. She could listen. She could hear what he had to say. But what would be the point? She already knew the script. Regret. A plea. An apology dressed in excuses. Or worse, a manipulation masked as vulnerability. She knew the layers by heart. The voice that once melted her now meant nothing. And yet, she sat there, the wind lifting strands of her hair as the moment lingered. After a few more breaths, she picked up the phone again, not to listen, but to delete the message. It disappeared with a soft swipe. Just like that. Later, as dusk folded itself into twilight, Caroline returned inside, her shawl trailing behind her like a whisper. The main lobby was softly lit by golden lamps. A few guests lingered at the bar. She passed them unnoticed, her mind drifting but content. She stopped briefly at the concierge desk to thank the staff for another smooth day, then continued toward her office, her heels tapping lightly on the marble floor. On her desk was a simple white envelope, handwritten. Inside, a note from one of the guests. A woman in her 60s, recently divorced, thanking Caroline for giving her a place to feel like more than someone's ex-wife. Caroline smiled, touched. These were the reasons she had done it all. These quiet affirmations. Not the applause, not the headlines, this. The real stories of women rebuilding. She turned on the small stereo by her window and let soft jazz fill the room. The kind Brett used to complain about, saying it was music that went nowhere. But she liked it for exactly that reason. It didn't push. It didn't demand. It simply flowed. As she sat at her desk, flipping through notes for next month's retreat program, a familiar voice called out from the door. Thought I might find you here. It was Marisol, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. You're supposed to be off, Caroline said with a smirk. I know, but I figured you might still be working. I brought reinforcements. They sat in companionable silence, sipping and watching the horizon darken through the window. Do you think he'll bounce back? Marisol asked eventually. Caroline shrugged, setting her glass down. He always does. That's his talent. But maybe this time, he'll learn something from it. Or maybe not. Either way, it's not my concern anymore. Marisol nodded. You really let it go, didn't you? I had to, Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. Outside, the lights around the resort flickered on, casting soft glows along the pathways, illuminating the trees and pools like a dreamland. Music played somewhere near the bar. Laughter rose in small bursts. It was alive. It was hers. Caroline walked Marisol to the door and paused, looking out one last time at the stars beginning to appear, one by one. Everything changes eventually, she murmured. Even the things we thought were permanent. Even him. Marisol asked. Caroline smiled. Especially him. After Marisol left, Caroline wandered back to the balcony and stood alone under the open sky. The breeze had cooled, brushing her arms, tangling her hair. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, not as a woman escaping something, but as one who had arrived, who had endured. No cameras, no drama, no revenge speech, just silence and peace. Far from the headlines, Brett Langford sat in a cold, windowless office in New York, answering to lawyers and scrambling to salvage what little reputation remained. He'd shaved, put on a tie, tried to smile again in meetings that had once bent around his will. But he could feel it. The shift. People no longer paused when he entered a room. They no longer waited for his opinion. They simply noted it and moved on. The empire was still standing, but the foundation was hollow. He walked into his penthouse, or what used to be his penthouse, now stripped of most furniture, the silence ringing loud against the marble. Boxes lined the hallway. Legal notices sat unopened on the counter. He poured a drink, but didn't sip it. Instead, he sat at the window and stared out over the skyline. He used to own that view, in his mind. Now it just stared back, unmoved. In his chest, something stirred. Not pain, not anger, something worse. Emptiness. And in that silence, for the first time, he finally understood what she meant all those years ago when she'd said, I hope you learn to live without needing to win. Caroline had let go. She had rebuilt. But Brett? He was still holding the pieces. And he didn't know how to let go.